The cold wind of Chicago cut through the thin blanket like a sharp knife, and two small bodies pressed closer together for warmth behind the large garbage bins of a busy restaurant called La Belle Étoile. Maya opened her tired eyes and looked at her twin sister Mia, who was still sleeping, her small face pale and her lips slightly blue from the cold December night that had been especially harsh this year. The girls were only 9 years old, identical in every way with their curly black hair, brown skin, and big brown eyes that had once sparkled with joy, but now carried a sadness too heavy for children so young. Maya gently touched her sister's forehead and felt relieved that there was no fever today, because last week Mia had been very sick, and Maya had been so scared that she might lose the only family she had left in this world. Their mother Grace had been a beautiful woman with a voice like an angel, and she had worked as a cleaner in office buildings during the day, and sang at a small church on Sundays where people would close their eyes and cry when they heard her sing. Grace had always told her daughters that their voices were gifts from God, and that no matter how hard life became, they should never stop singing because music had the power to heal hearts and change lives. But 6 months ago, Grace had gotten very sick with a disease in her lungs, and because they had no money for good doctors or medicine, she had become weaker and weaker until one night she held her daughters close and whispered that she would always be with them in their hearts. Maya remembered that terrible night like it was yesterday, the way her mother's hand had become cold in hers, the way Mia had screamed and cried, and the way their whole world had fallen apart in just a few hours. Their father David had never been a strong man, and after Grace died, he had started drinking heavily and staying out late, coming home only to sleep, and sometimes not coming home at all for days. One morning, just 3 weeks after their mother's funeral, Maya woke up to find a note on the kitchen table that simply said he was sorry, but he could not take care of them anymore, and that he was leaving and never coming back. Maya had stared at that note for a long time, not crying, not screaming, just feeling something inside her heart turn hard and cold like a stone, because she understood in that moment that she and Mia were now alone in this big and scary world. Their landlord had given them 1 week to leave the small apartment because there was no one to pay the rent, and none of their relatives wanted to take in 2 young girls who came with nothing but problems and expenses. Their Aunt Patricia had said she already had 4 children of her own and could not afford 2 more mouths to feed, and their Uncle James had simply closed the door in their faces without saying a single word. Maya had taken her sister's hand that day and walked out into the streets of Chicago with nothing but a small backpack containing some clothes, a photograph of their mother, and the old golden locket that Grace had worn every single day of her life. The locket had a tiny picture of the twins as Bobbies inside it, and Maya wore it around her neck now, keeping it hidden under her shirt so no one would try to steal it from her. For the first few weeks, the girls had stayed at a homeless shelter where kind people gave them food and a bed, but the shelter was crowded and sometimes scary with people who yelled in the night and fought over small things. One night, an older boy had tried to steal Maya's backpack while she was sleeping, and even though she had fought him off, she decided it was safer to live on the streets where at least she could see danger coming. So they had found this spot behind La Belle Étoile, one of the fanciest restaurants in downtown Chicago, where rich people came to eat food that cost more money than Maya had ever seen in her entire life. The restaurant workers sometimes threw away food that was still good, and Maya would wait until late at night to search through the garbage bins for anything that she and Mia could eat. It was not a good life, but it was survival, and Maya had made a promise to her mother's memory that she would keep Mia safe no matter what it took, and no matter how hard things became. Mia stirred in her sleep and slowly opened her eyes, looking up at her sister with a weak smile that broke Maya's heart because even in these terrible circumstances, Mia still tried to be brave and hopeful. "Good morning, Maya," Mia whispered, her voice rough and tired. Did you sleep at all last night?" Maya nodded even though she had barely closed her eyes, spending most of the night watching over her sister and listening for any sounds of danger approaching their little hiding spot. "I slept fine," Maya lied, because she never wanted Mia to worry about her. "How are you feeling today? Are you hungry?" Mia nodded slowly, her hand moving to her stomach, and Maya could hear the rumbling sound that told her it had been too long since they had eaten anything real. Yesterday they had found only a few pieces of stale bread and some vegetables that were starting to go bad, and the day before that they had eaten nothing at all, because the garbage bins had been empty. Maya looked at the back door of the restaurant where she could smell the amazing aromas of cooking meat and fresh bread and warm soup, and her own stomach twisted with a hunger that seemed to eat her from the inside. She thought about their mother and the songs she had taught them, the way their voices would blend together in perfect harmony, and how people at church would give them coins and tell them they were blessed with extraordinary talent. An idea began to form in Maya's young mind, a desperate and scary idea that made her heart beat fast with fear and hope at the same time. Maybe, just maybe, if she and Mia could sing for the rich people inside that restaurant, someone might be kind enough to give them something to eat, maybe even a real meal with hot food and clean water. It was a crazy idea, and Maya knew that poor dirty girls like them were not welcome in fancy places like La Belle Étoile, where women wore diamonds and men wore suits that cost more than a car. But what other choice did they have? Because Mia was getting weaker every day, and Maya knew that if they did not find real food soon, something very bad was going to happen. She looked at her sister's thin face and made a decision that would change their lives forever, though she did not know it yet. "Mia," Maya said softly, taking her sister's cold hand in hers, "I have an idea, but you have to be brave and trust me. Can you do that?" Mia looked at her sister with complete faith in her eyes and nodded without hesitation, because Maya had never let her down, and she believed in her sister more than anything else in this world. "I trust you, Maya," Mia said simply. "I will always trust you." And with those words, the two little girls prepared to face a world that had been so cruel to them, armed with nothing but their voices and the hope that somewhere out there, someone would show them kindness. 3 days had passed since Maya and Mia had eaten anything more than a few bites of old bread, and the hunger had become a constant pain that never went away no matter how much water they drank from the public fountain in the park. Mia had stopped complaining about being hungry 2 days ago, and that scared Maya more than the hunger itself because when her sister stopped talking about food, it meant she was becoming too weak to even think about it. The winter sun was setting over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful if Maya had the energy to notice such things anymore. She sat with her back against the cold brick wall of the restaurant, holding Mia in her arms and trying to keep her warm as the temperature dropped lower and lower with each passing hour. Mia's eyes were closed and her breathing was slow and shallow, and Maya could feel how light her sister had become, like a little bird with hollow bones that might break at any moment. "Mia, please stay awake," Maya whispered, gently shaking her sister. "You have to stay awake, please, for me." Mia opened her eyes slowly, and Maya could see that they had lost some of their shine, looking dull and tired like the eyes of an old person, instead of a 9-year-old girl. "I am so tired, Maya," Mia said in a voice barely louder than a breath, "and so cold. Can we go somewhere warm tonight?" Maya felt tears burning in her eyes because she had no warm place to take her sister, no home, no shelter, nothing but this dirty alley behind a restaurant full of people who had more food than they could possibly eat. Through the back window of the kitchen, Maya could see the chefs working over hot stoves, preparing beautiful dishes that looked like art, with colorful vegetables and golden meats and creamy sauces. She could hear the sounds of laughter and music coming from inside the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, and the chatter of happy people who had never known what it felt like to be hungry or cold or scared. How unfair the world was, Maya thought to herself, that some people could throw away more food in one night than she and her sister could eat in a month. She thought about the customers inside, probably complaining about small things like their wine not being cold enough or their steak being cooked a little too much, while just a few feet away, two little girls were slowly starving to death. Maya had tried begging on the street corners during the past few weeks, holding out her hand and asking for spare change, but most people walked past without even looking at her, and some had said mean things that made her feel like she was less than human. One man had told her to get a job, and she had wanted to scream at him that she was only 9 years old and had no one to help her and no place to go. Another woman had said she was probably just pretending to be poor and would use any money to buy drugs, which had hurt Maya deeply because she had never even seen drugs in her life. But some people had been kind, giving her a few dollars here and there, and once an old lady had bought her and Mia sandwiches from a nearby shop and told them that God loved them even when the world did not. That kindness had kept Maya going, the belief that somewhere in this cold city there were still good people who cared about children like them. Now, sitting in the darkening alley, Maya remembered what her mother used to say about their singing, how it had the power to touch hearts and open doors that seemed locked forever. Grace had always believed that music was the great equalizer, that when people heard a beautiful song, they forgot about rich and poor and black and white, and just felt the music in their souls. Maybe, Maya thought, that was the answer to their prayers. Maybe their voices could do what their words and their begging could not. She looked at the front of the restaurant, where well-dressed people were entering through beautiful glass doors, laughing and talking like they had no worries in the world. Those people had money, lots of money, and they were probably in good moods because they were about to enjoy an expensive meal at one of the finest restaurants in Chicago. If Maya could get inside, if she could just get the chance to sing for them, maybe someone would feel moved by their song and help them, even if it was just with a plate of food. The idea terrified her because she knew that people like them were not supposed to enter places like that, and the workers would probably throw them out the moment they saw their dirty clothes and messy hair. But what was the alternative? To sit here and watch her sister fade away like a candle running out of wax, to do nothing while Mia got weaker and sicker with each passing day. No, Maya decided. She would rather face rejection and humiliation 1,000 times than let her sister suffer any longer without trying everything possible. She gently sat Mia up and looked into her tired eyes, trying to give her sister some of the courage that she herself was not sure she had. "Mia, I need you to listen to me carefully," Maya said, her voice steady even though her heart was racing. "We are going to go into that restaurant and we are going to sing, just like Mama taught us." Mia blinked slowly, confusion showing on her pale face as she tried to understand what her sister was saying. "But Maya, they will not let us in," Mia whispered. "Look at us. We are dirty and our clothes are torn. They will tell us to go away." Maya nodded because she knew her sister was probably right, but she also knew that they had nothing left to lose. "Maybe they will tell us to go away, but maybe they will not. And even if there is just a small chance that someone in there will hear us sing and decide to help us, we have to take that chance. Do you understand?" Mia looked at her sister for a long moment, and slowly a small spark of something returned to her dull eyes, a tiny flame of hope that had been almost completely gone. "Mama always said our voices were special," Mia said quietly, remembering the warmth of their mother's arms and the sound of her gentle voice. "Yes, she did," Maya agreed, her own voice breaking slightly. "She said we could move mountains with our songs, and tonight we are going to see if that is true." Maya helped her sister stand up on shaky legs, and together they walked around to the front of the restaurant where a doorman in a fancy uniform stood guard like a soldier, protecting a castle. The doorman saw them coming and his face immediately changed, his smile disappearing, and his eyes becoming hard and unwelcoming. Maya took a deep breath and squeezed her sister's hand, feeling the old locket warm against her chest, and she prayed silently to her mother in heaven to give them strength. This was their moment, their one chance to change their fate, and Maya was not going to let fear stop her from fighting for her sister's life. "Ready?" she asked Mia, and her sister nodded weakly. "Ready," Mia whispered back. And together, the two hungry, tired, desperate little girls walked toward the golden lights of La Belle Étoile, not knowing that their lives were about to change in ways they could never have imagined. The doorman stepped forward the moment Maya and Mia approached the entrance, his tall body blocking the beautiful glass doors like a wall that could not be moved. He was a large man with gray hair and cold blue eyes, and he wore a uniform that probably cost more money than their mother had made in an entire month of cleaning offices. "What do you think you are doing?" he demanded, looking down at the two small girls with disgust on his face. "This is not a place for beggars. Go away before I call the police." Maya felt her heart sink, but she forced herself to stand tall and meet the man's eyes, even though her knees were shaking with fear. "Please, sir, we are not here to beg," Maya said, trying to keep her voice calm and polite. "We just want a chance to sing for the people inside. We are very good singers and maybe someone would like to give us some food in exchange." The doorman laughed, but it was not a kind laugh. It was the cruel laugh of someone who thought he was better than the people standing in front of him. "Sing?" he repeated mockingly. "You want to walk into the finest restaurant in Chicago, looking like homeless trash and sing for our guests? Do you have any idea how ridiculous you sound?" Mia pressed closer to her sister, her thin body trembling from both cold and fear, and Maya felt a surge of anger rise in her chest at the way this man was treating them. "We are not trash," Maya said firmly, her voice stronger now. "We are children who have nowhere else to go and nothing to eat, and our mother taught us to sing before she died. Is it so wrong to offer the only thing we have?" The doorman's eyes flickered for just a moment, something passing across his face that might have been guilt or maybe just annoyance at being challenged by a 9-year-old girl. But then his expression hardened again, and he pointed down the street with one gloved hand. "I do not care about your sad story, little girl. Every beggar has one. Now get out of here before I lose my patience." Maya was about to argue more when the door opened behind the doorman and a well-dressed couple walked out, the woman wrapped in a fur coat and the man checking his expensive gold watch. "What is going on here, Marcus?" the man asked the doorman, glancing at the twins with the same look someone might give to a bug on their shoe. "Nothing, sir, just some street children making trouble. I am handling it." The woman in the fur coat looked at Maya and Mia and wrinkled her nose as if she smelled something bad. This is what I mean about this city going downhill," she said to her husband. "They should clean up these homeless people before they ruin the neighborhood." Maya felt the words hit her like punches, each one adding to the pain already in her heart, but she refused to cry in front of these cruel people who saw her and her sister as nothing but problems to be swept away. The couple walked past them and climbed into a long black limousine that had been waiting at the curb, and Maya watched them go with a mixture of anger and sadness that she could not quite understand. How could people have so much and care so little about those who had nothing? How could they look at two starving children and feel only disgust instead of compassion? "You see," the doorman said, sounding almost pleased, "people like you do not belong here. Now leave or I will make you leave." Maya looked at her sister, seeing how pale Mia had become, seeing the way her legs were barely holding her up, and she knew that if she gave up now, she might never get another chance. "No," Maya said, and her voice rang out clear and strong in the cold night air. The doorman blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting defiance from such a small girl. "Excuse me." "I said no," Maya repeated. "We are not leaving until someone inside that restaurant hears us sing, and you can call the police if you want to, but I am not going to let my sister starve just because you think we are not good enough to be here." The doorman's face turned red with anger, and he reached out to grab Maya's arm, but before he could touch her, the glass door opened again and a voice called out. "Marcus, what on earth is happening out here?" A man in an expensive black suit stood in the doorway, tall and thin with perfectly styled gray hair, and a small microphone attached to his ear. This was Philippe, the maitre d' of La Belle Étoile, the person in charge of making sure that everything in the restaurant ran smoothly and that only the right kind of people were allowed inside. "I am sorry, Monsieur Philippe," the doorman said quickly, his attitude changing completely in the presence of his boss. "These children were trying to get in. I was just about to remove them." Philippe looked at Maya and Mia with eyes that were calculating and cold, taking in their dirty clothes, their tangled hair, their thin and hungry faces. "How did they even get this close to the door?" he asked sharply. "Our guests should not have to see this kind of thing. It ruins the atmosphere." Maya stepped forward before the doorman could respond, pulling Mia gently along with her. "Please, sir, we just want to sing one song," Maya said, putting every bit of hope she had into her words. "If the guests like it, maybe someone will give us a little bit of food, and if they do not like it, we will leave right away, I promise." Philippe raised one eyebrow, looking at Maya as if she were a stray cat that had wandered into his fine establishment. "Sing," he said, his French accent making the word sound even more dismissive. "This is a restaurant, not a street corner. We have professional musicians who are paid to entertain our guests." "But we are good," Mia spoke up for the first time, her voice weak but determined. "Our mama said we had the voices of angels, please. We are so hungry." Something shifted in the air, and Maya noticed that several people inside the restaurant were now looking through the glass doors at the scene unfolding outside. Philippe noticed too, and his face tightened with irritation, because the last thing he wanted was a scene that might upset his wealthy guests. "Fine," he said suddenly, surprising everyone including himself. "You want to sing so badly, you will get your chance, but when you fail, and you will fail, you will leave and never come back here again, understood?" Maya nodded quickly, her heart jumping with a mixture of joy and terror. "Yes, sir, we understand, thank you so much." Philippe turned and walked back into the restaurant, gesturing for them to follow, and Maya took Mia's hand and stepped through the golden doors into a world completely different from anything they had ever known. The restaurant was beautiful beyond words, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and white tablecloths on every table and flowers arranged perfectly in silver vases. Rich people sat everywhere, eating food that smelled like heaven and drinking wine from glasses that sparkled like diamonds in the soft light. And at the best table in the restaurant, sitting alone with a glass of whiskey in his hand, was a man whose cruel laughter would soon ring through the air. A man who had forgotten what it meant to be human, a man named Richard Calloway. Richard Calloway had come to La Belle Étoile that night to celebrate the biggest business deal of his already impressive career, a deal that would add another $50 million to his already massive fortune. At 52 years old, Richard was one of the richest men in Chicago, a real estate tycoon whose name was known in boardrooms and business magazines all across the country. He had built his empire from nothing, or so he liked to tell people, starting with a small construction company in his 20s and growing it into a billion-dollar corporation that owned buildings, hotels, and shopping centers in 20 different cities. Richard sat alone at his favorite table, the one by the window with the best view of the restaurant, sipping expensive whiskey, and reading congratulatory messages on his phone from business partners and fellow millionaires. His suit was Italian and cost more than most people made in a month. His watch was Swiss and worth more than most people made in a year. And his shoes were handmade by a craftsman in London, who only served the richest clients in the world. Everything about Richard screamed success and power, from the way he held himself to the cold confidence in his gray eyes. But if anyone looked closely, they might notice that success had not made Richard happy, that despite all his money and all his achievements, there was something empty and hard in the lines of his face. He had no wife, having divorced 3 times and decided that marriage was not worth the trouble. He had no children, having always been too busy building his empire to think about raising a family. And he had no real friends, only business partners who wanted his money and employees who feared his temper. Tonight, as he sat in the warm glow of the restaurant, Richard Calloway was the loneliest man in the room, though he would never admit it even to himself. He was just taking another sip of his whiskey when he heard a commotion near the front of the restaurant and looked up to see Philippe walking toward the dining area with a look of barely contained frustration on his face. Behind Philippe walked 2 small figures, and Richard squinted to see them better in the dim light. They were children, girls by the look of them, and they were clearly not the usual clientele of La Belle Étoile. Their clothes were torn and dirty, their hair was tangled and unwashed, and even from across the room Richard could see how thin and pale they were. A wave of disgust washed over him as he wondered what Philippe was thinking, bringing homeless children into this fine establishment where Richard was trying to enjoy his celebration in peace. Philippe stopped in the center of the dining room and cleared his throat, and slowly the chatter and laughter died down as the wealthy guests turned to see what was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," Philippe announced, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "these young ladies have requested the opportunity to sing for you tonight. They have promised to leave immediately afterward, so please indulge them for just a moment." Murmurs spread through the room, some confused, some amused, some annoyed that their expensive evening was being interrupted by street children. Richard felt his irritation growing as he looked at the 2 girls standing in the middle of the restaurant like frightened rabbits, surrounded by wolves. Who did they think they were, coming into his favorite restaurant with their poverty and their dirty faces and their desperate eyes? He had worked hard to escape that kind of life, to rise above the dirt and the hunger and the hopelessness, and he did not want to be reminded of it by 2 beggars who should have been removed from the property immediately. The smaller of the 2 girls swayed slightly on her feet, looking like she might collapse at any moment, and the older one held her hand tightly, keeping her upright. Something about the older girl's posture, the way she stood with her chin up despite the stares and whispers, reminded Richard of someone, though he could not quite remember who. "Sing for food," Richard heard himself say loudly, his voice cutting through the whispers like a knife. "What is this, a circus? Did I pay $500 for dinner to watch street performers beg for scraps?" Several people at nearby tables laughed, and Richard felt a surge of satisfaction at their response. The older girl turned to look at him, and Richard was struck by the fierce dignity in her brown eyes, a pride that seemed almost defiant given her obvious circumstances. "We are not begging, sir," the girl said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her thin body. "We are offering to sing, that is different." Richard laughed again, louder this time, and slapped his hand on the table. "Offering to sing? What are you going to sing? The alphabet? Some nursery rhyme your mother taught you before she dropped you off at the nearest shelter?" The words were cruel, and Richard knew it. But he did not care because making fun of people who could not fight back had always been one of his small pleasures. But something strange happened when he mentioned their mother. The smaller girl's face crumpled with pain, and tears began to slide down her pale cheeks. And the older girl's eyes, those proud, defiant eyes, filled with a sadness so deep that Richard felt something stir in a part of himself he thought he had killed long ago. "Our mother is dead, sir," the older girl said quietly, and her words carried across the silent restaurant like stones dropped into still water. "She died 6 months ago, And she did teach us to sing. It was the last gift she gave us before she left. The laughter in the room died instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence as the wealthy guests shifted in their seats and avoided eye contact with the two orphan girls. Richard felt his face flush, though whether with shame or anger he was not entirely sure. "Well," he said, trying to recover his composure, "that is a sad story, but sad stories do not pay the bills, and they do not entertain my dinner." He picked up his glass of whiskey and waved his hand dismissively. "Fine, go ahead and sing your little song if it will make you feel better, but make it quick because my steak is getting cold, and I have no patience for amateur hour." Maya looked at her sister, seeing the tears on Mia's face and the hurt in her eyes, and she felt a surge of determination rise up in her chest. This man, this cruel rich man who thought he was better than everyone else, had insulted their mother's memory and laughed at their suffering. But instead of anger, Maya felt something else, something her mother had always talked about, the power of forgiveness and the ability of music to reach even the coldest heart. "Thank you for the chance," Maya said politely, her voice calm and strong. "Come on, Mia, let us show them what Mama taught us." Mia wiped her tears with the back of her hand and nodded, and together the two sisters turned to face the room full of rich people who expected nothing from them. Richard leaned back in his chair with a smirk on his face, ready to be disappointed, ready to mock them again as soon as they opened their mouths. He had no idea that in just a few moments, everything he thought he knew about himself and his carefully constructed life was about to come crashing down around him. The twins took a deep breath together, just as their mother had taught them, and Maya squeezed her sister's hand one final time. And then they began to sing. The first note that came from Maya's mouth was soft and gentle, floating through the air like a feather carried by a warm breeze. It was the opening of "You Raise Me Up," the last song their mother had taught them, the song she had sung to them every night before bed, the song she had been humming when she took her final breath. Mia joined in on the second note, her voice blending with her sister's in a harmony so pure and so perfect that it seemed to hang in the air like something sacred. The wealthy guests of La Belle Étoile froze in their seats, forks halfway to mouths, wine glasses suspended in midair, conversations dying on their lips as the voices of two hungry children filled the room. "When I am down and oh my soul so weary," the twins sang, their voices growing stronger with each word. "When troubles come and my heart burdened be." Maya closed her eyes and let the music carry her away, away from the cold alley and the empty stomach and the cruel laughter, back to a time when her mother was alive and the world was safe and full of love. "Then I am still and wait here in the silence, until you come and sit a while with me." Mia's voice soared on the higher notes, clear as crystal and pure as morning light, while Maya held the lower melody steady and strong like the foundation of a beautiful building. The song filled every corner of the restaurant, wrapping around the crystal chandeliers and flowing over the white tablecloths, and touching every person in the room whether they wanted to be touched or not. At a table near the kitchen, a woman in a red dress felt tears spring to her eyes and did not even try to wipe them away. Her name was Elizabeth, and she was a successful lawyer who had not cried in public since her grandmother's funeral 15 years ago. But something about these two small voices, so full of pain and hope and love, broke through the walls she had built around her heart. "You raise me up so I can stand on mountains," the twins continued, their voices rising together like two birds taking flight. "You raise me up to walk on stormy seas." Across the room, an elderly couple held hands under the table, remembering their own daughter who had passed away from cancer 10 years ago. She had loved to sing just like these girls, and hearing their voices was like receiving a message from her spirit, a reminder that love never truly dies. "I am strong when I am on your shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can be." Philippe the maitre d' stood by the entrance, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, But if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen that his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. He had been so quick to dismiss these children, so eager to protect his wealthy guests from the discomfort of seeing poverty up close, and now he felt ashamed of his coldness. Near the window, a young businessman named James sat frozen in his chair, thinking about his own mother who had sacrificed everything to give him a better life. She had worked 3 jobs to put him through college, and he had not called her in 6 months because he was always too busy, too important, too caught up in his own success. These 2 girls had lost their mother forever, and here he was taking his own mother for granted while she was still alive. The twins reached the final chorus, their voices building to a crescendo that seemed to fill not just the restaurant but the entire world. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. Maya opened her eyes and looked directly at Richard Calloway, the man who had laughed at them and mocked their dead mother. I am strong when I am on your shoulders. And what she saw in his face made her forget all the cruel words he had spoken. You raise me up to more than I can be. Richard Calloway was crying. Not just a single tear or a slight moistening of the eyes, but real crying, with tears streaming down his cheeks and his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The cold, cruel millionaire who had built walls around his heart for 40 years was falling apart in the middle of the fanciest restaurant in Chicago. Because when he heard the twins sing, when he saw the love and pain and hope in their young faces, he was no longer a 52-year-old billionaire sitting in an expensive suit. He was a 10-year-old boy again, standing at a bus station in a poor neighborhood, watching his father's car drive away and never come back. He was a child again, hungry and scared and alone, being told by his mother that they would have to move because they could not pay the rent. He was that desperate, forgotten boy who had promised himself that he would never be poor again, that he would never be weak again, that he would never let anyone see him cry again. And all these years he had kept that promise, building his fortune brick by brick while burying his humanity deeper and deeper until he forgot it even existed. But these 2 girls, these 2 hungry, homeless, orphaned girls who had nothing in the world except each other and their mother's songs, had reached into the grave where he had buried his heart and pulled it back into the light. The final note of the song faded away, leaving a silence so complete that you could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Maya and Mia stood in the center of the room, holding hands and waiting for the response they so desperately needed. For a moment, nothing happened. And then slowly, one person began to clap. It was Elizabeth in the red dress, rising to her feet with tears still wet on her cheeks. Then James the businessman joined her, standing up and applauding with hands that trembled slightly. Then the elderly couple, then Philippe, then the waiters and the kitchen staff who had come out to listen. Within seconds, the entire restaurant was on its feet, giving a standing ovation to 2 little girls who had just wanted a plate of food. But Maya was not looking at the crowd. She was looking at Richard Calloway, who remained seated at his table, his face wet with tears, his hands gripping the tablecloth like a man trying not to drown. She did not understand why this cruel man was crying, or why he could not seem to take his eyes off her and her sister. She did not know that in just a few moments, he would stand up and walk toward them. She did not know that the words he would speak would change their lives forever. All she knew was that they had done it. They had sung their mother's song, and somehow, against all odds, they had touched the hearts of people who had seemed untouchable. Mia squeezed her hand and whispered, "We did it, Maya, we really did it." Maya nodded, too overwhelmed to speak, as the applause continued to wash over them like warm waves on a cold night. And across the room, Richard Calloway wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and slowly rose to his feet, not knowing what he was going to do next, only knowing that something inside him had broken open and could never be closed again. Richard Calloway sat frozen in his chair as the applause thundered around him. But he heard none of it because he was lost in memories he had spent 4 decades trying to forget. The song had unlocked a door in his mind that he had sealed shut with money and success and cold indifference. And now, the memories were flooding back like water breaking through a dam. He was 10 years old again, standing in the small kitchen of a run-down apartment in the poorest part of Detroit, watching his father pack a suitcase while his mother begged him to stay. His father's name was Thomas, and he had been a factory worker who lost his job when the plant closed down, and instead of fighting to support his family, he had decided to run away and start a new life without them. "I cannot do this anymore," Thomas had said, not even looking at his wife or his son. "I am not cut out to be a father, I am sorry." Young Richard had stood there in his worn pajamas, not understanding why his father was leaving, not understanding what he had done wrong to make his daddy want to go away. "Please, Thomas, think about Richard," his mother had cried, her voice breaking with desperation. "He needs his father, we can figure this out together." But Thomas had just shaken his head and walked out the door, and Richard had run to the window to watch his father's old car drive away into the gray morning, never to return. That was the day something inside Richard had died. The day he learned that love was a weakness, and that the only person he could truly count on was himself. His mother Margaret had done her best to raise him alone, working double shifts at a diner and cleaning houses on the weekends just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. But it was never enough, and Richard remembered the hunger that gnawed at his stomach during those long years, the shame of wearing clothes from charity bins, the humiliation of other kids making fun of him for being poor. He remembered one Christmas when he was 12, when his mother had cried because she could not afford to buy him a single present, and he had told her it was okay even though his heart was breaking. "Someday I will be rich," young Richard had promised her, holding her thin hands in his. "Someday I will buy you a big house and you will never have to work again." Margaret had smiled through her tears and kissed his forehead, telling him she was proud of him no matter what, and Richard had carried that promise like a fire burning in his chest. He had worked harder than anyone else in school, getting scholarships to college and then to business school, never stopping, never resting, never letting anyone see the scared little boy hiding behind his ambition. By the time he was 30, he had made his first million, and by 40, he was one of the richest men in the Midwest. But his mother had not lived to see his success, dying of a heart attack when Richard was only 28, alone in the same small apartment where she had raised him. Richard had not even been there when she passed because he had been too busy closing a business deal, too focused on making money to spend time with the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. That guilt had haunted him ever since, adding another brick to the wall he built around his heart, another reason to never let anyone get close enough to hurt him again. He had married 3 times, but each marriage had failed because he could not open up, could not be vulnerable, could not let his wives see the broken boy behind the successful man. He had no children because he was terrified of becoming like his father, terrified that he would abandon them or fail them or hurt them the way he had been hurt. So he had buried himself in work and money and the cold comfort of success, telling himself that he was happy, that he had everything he needed, that love was for fools who had not learned the truth about the world. And now, sitting in this fancy restaurant with tears streaming down his face, Richard realized what a terrible lie he had been living. These 2 little girls, Maya and Mia, with their torn clothes and their empty stomachs and their beautiful voices, had shown him something he had forgot. They had nothing, absolutely nothing, except each other and the songs their mother had taught them. And yet there was more love in the way they held hands, more courage in the way they stood before this room of strangers, more humanity in their hungry eyes than Richard had felt in decades. He saw himself in them, the scared child he used to be, The boy who had known hunger and abandonment and the cruelty of a world that did not care about poor people. But unlike him, these girls had not let their suffering make them hard and cold and bitter. They had held onto their mother's love, carried it with them like a light in the darkness, and used it to touch the hearts of everyone in this room. Even his heart, which he had thought was beyond saving. Richard wiped his eyes again, embarrassed by his tears but unable to stop them, and he noticed that people were staring at him with curious and confused expressions. The great Richard Calloway, the ruthless businessman who had never shown weakness in his life, was crying in public over 2 homeless children. Part of him wanted to leave, to escape this moment of vulnerability and return to the safety of his cold and lonely mansion. But another part of him, the part he thought had died 40 years ago in that kitchen in Detroit, would not let him run away. Because running away was what his father had done, and Richard had spent his whole life proving that he was not like his father, that he was stronger, that he was better. But what good was strength if he used it only to build walls and count money and push people away? What good was success if he had no one to share it with, no one who truly cared about him, no one who would cry at his funeral except lawyers and business partners waiting to divide up his fortune? The applause was finally dying down, and Richard watched as the 2 girls stood in the center of the room, looking overwhelmed and hopeful and so painfully young. The older one, Maya, had a look of fierce determination on her face that reminded Richard of his mother, that same stubborn refusal to give up no matter how hard life became. And the younger one, Mia, had a sweetness and vulnerability that made Richard's chest ache with a feeling he barely recognized. It was the feeling of caring about someone other than himself, the feeling of wanting to help, the feeling of being human again after so many years of being a machine. Richard did not know what he was going to do, did not have a plan or a strategy or an exit route like he always had in business. All he knew was that he could not sit here and do nothing while these 2 children walked back out into the cold night to starve in some alley behind his favorite restaurant. He had to do something, had to say something, had to be someone other than the cruel man who had laughed at their suffering just minutes ago. Slowly, on legs that felt strangely unsteady, Richard Calloway rose from his chair and began to walk toward the twins. And with every step he took, he felt the wall around his heart crumble a little more, making room for something new, something terrifying, something that felt like the beginning of a different kind of life. The crowd parted as Richard walked toward the twins, and Maya felt her heart begin to race with fear as she watched the tall man approach. This was the same man who had laughed at them, who had mocked their dead mother, who had called them circus performers and made everyone else laugh at their suffering. What did he want now? To humiliate them again, to tell them their singing was terrible, to have them thrown out onto the street where they came from. Maya stepped slightly in front of her sister, her small body tense and ready to protect Mia from whatever cruelty this rich man had planned. But as Richard got closer, Maya noticed something strange about his face. His eyes were red and swollen, his cheeks were wet with tears, and there was an expression on his face that she had never expected to see. He looked broken, like a man who had just woken up from a long and terrible nightmare and did not know where he was. Richard stopped a few feet away from the twins, and for a long moment he just stood there, looking at them as if he was seeing them for the first time. The entire restaurant was silent, watching this unexpected scene unfold, wondering what the famous Richard Calloway was going to do next. "I am sorry," Richard said finally, and his voice cracked on the words like ice breaking apart in spring. Maya blinked in surprise, not sure she had heard him correctly. "What?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I said I am sorry," Richard repeated, his voice stronger now but still thick with emotion. "I am sorry for laughing at you. I am sorry for the terrible things I said about your mother. I am sorry for being so cruel when you were only asking for a chance." Mia peeked out from behind her sister, her tired eyes wide with confusion and cautious hope. "You really mean it?" Mia asked softly, and her innocent question seemed to hit Richard like a punch to the gut. "Yes, I really mean it," he said, and he did something that shocked everyone in the room, including himself. He knelt down on the expensive marble floor of La Belle Étoile, ruining his $10,000 suit, so that he could look the twins in the eyes at their level. "I was once like you," Richard said quietly, speaking now only to the girls as if the rest of the world had disappeared. "I was once a poor boy with nothing, a boy whose father left him and whose mother worked herself to death just to keep him fed." Maya stared at him, trying to understand how this wealthy man in his fancy suit could ever have been anything like her and Mia. "I forgot what that felt like," Richard continued. "I spent so many years building walls and making money that I forgot what it was like to be hungry and scared and alone. But your song reminded me. Your song broke through all those walls and made me remember." Tears were forming in Maya's eyes now, though she tried hard to blink them away because she had learned that crying in front of strangers was dangerous. "Why are you telling us this?" Maya asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay strong. Richard took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his words came out in a rush as if he was afraid he would lose his courage if he waited too long. "I want to help you," he said. "I do not know exactly what that means yet, but I know that I cannot let you walk back out into the cold tonight. I cannot let you starve in some alley while I go home to my empty mansion and eat food I do not even taste." He reached out slowly, giving Maya time to pull away if she wanted to, and gently took her small hand in his large one. "Come with me tonight," Richard said. "Let me give you a warm meal, a safe place to sleep, and tomorrow we will figure out what comes next. I promise I will not hurt you. I promise I will not abandon you like everyone else has." Maya looked down at his hand holding hers, and she felt something she had not felt since her mother died. She felt safe. But years of living on the street had taught her to be suspicious of kindness, especially from strangers who seemed too good to be true. "Why should we trust you?" Maya asked, meeting his eyes with a directness that made Richard flinch. "You were so mean to us just a few minutes ago. How do we know this is not some kind of trick?" Richard nodded slowly, accepting her suspicion as completely reasonable. "You are right to question me," he said honestly. "I have not given you any reason to trust me, and I do not expect you to believe my words after the way I behaved." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his business card, handing it to Maya. "My name is Richard Calloway, and I am one of the richest men in the city. Everyone here knows who I am, and if I tried to hurt you, there would be 100 witnesses." Maya looked at the card, not understanding most of the words on it but recognizing that it looked important and official. "I am not asking you to trust me completely," Richard continued. "I am just asking you to give me a chance to prove that I can be better than the man who laughed at you tonight. Can you do that?" Maya turned to look at her sister, seeing the exhaustion and hunger written all over Mia's pale face. Mia could not last much longer on the streets, and Maya knew that if she did not find help soon, something terrible was going to happen. This man might be lying, he might be dangerous, he might be the worst mistake Maya had ever made. But he might also be the answer to their prayers, the miracle their mother had always told them to believe in. "One night," Maya said finally, turning back to face Richard. "We will come with you for one night, but if you try anything, if you hurt us or scare us, we will run and we will scream and we will make sure everyone knows what you did." Richard nodded solemnly, accepting her terms without argument. "That is fair," he said. "One night, and if you want to leave in the morning, I will not stop you. I will even give you money to help you survive, no matter what you decide." He stood up slowly, his knees aching from kneeling on the hard floor, and turned to face the stunned crowd of wealthy diners. "Philippe," Richard called out to the maitre d', Please have the chef prepare the best meal this restaurant can offer for my two young guests, and put it on my tab along with a generous tip for the entire staff." Philippe nodded quickly, still too shocked to speak, and hurried toward the kitchen. Richard looked down at the twins, and, for the first time in many years, a genuine smile crossed his face. "First you eat," he said gently. "Then we go somewhere warm. Does that sound okay?" Mia nodded eagerly, her hunger overcoming her fear, and even Maya allowed herself a small smile as she thought about eating real food for the first time in days. Richard led them to his table by the window, pulling out chairs for them like they were honored guests instead of homeless children. And as the other diners watched in amazement, the cold millionaire who never showed kindness to anyone sat down with two little girls and began the long journey of learning how to be human again. None of them knew what the future would hold, but in that moment, sitting in the warm light of the restaurant with the promise of food and safety ahead of them, Maya allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten existed. She allowed herself to feel hope. The first few months in Richard's mansion were strange and difficult for everyone involved, filled with awkward silences, misunderstandings, and the slow, painful process of learning to trust. Richard's home was enormous, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Chicago with more rooms than Maya could count and gardens that seemed to go on forever. When the twins first walked through the front door that night after leaving the restaurant, Mia had gasped in wonder at the marble floors and crystal chandeliers and paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum. "This is your house," Mia had whispered, her eyes as big as plates, "the whole thing." Richard had nodded, suddenly feeling embarrassed by the excessive wealth he had accumulated, seeing it through the eyes of children who had been sleeping behind garbage bins just hours ago. "It is too big for one person," he had admitted quietly. "It has always been too big." Maya had said nothing, her sharp eyes scanning every corner for danger, her body tense and ready to grab her sister and run at the first sign of trouble. That wariness did not go away easily, not even after weeks of sleeping in soft beds and eating warm meals and wearing clean clothes that Richard had bought for them. Maya watched Richard constantly, looking for the trick, waiting for the moment when he would reveal his true nature and hurt them like so many others had. She would not let Mia out of her sight, insisting on sleeping in the same room even though there were a dozen empty bedrooms in the mansion. And whenever Richard tried to get close, tried to show affection or offer comfort, Maya would pull away with suspicion in her eyes. Richard did not blame her for being careful because he understood that trust had to be earned, not demanded. He hired tutors to help the girls catch up on the education they had missed while living on the streets, and he watched with pride as they both proved to be quick learners with hungry minds. He hired a kind woman named Sarah to be their nanny, someone who could provide the gentle feminine presence that he knew he could not offer. And he hired a child psychologist named Dr. Williams, who came to the house twice a week to help the twins process their trauma and grief. But despite all these helpers and all his money, Richard quickly realized that what the girls needed most was something he could not buy. They needed him, his time, his attention, his presence in their daily lives. The first time Richard tried to read them a bedtime story, Mia had curled up against him eagerly while Maya sat stiffly on the other side of the bed with her arms crossed. He had chosen a book about a little bear who lost his mother, not realizing how painful the subject would be, and halfway through the story Mia had started to cry. Richard had panicked, not knowing what to do, and he had looked at Maya for help with desperate eyes. Maya had sighed and crawled across the bed to hold her sister, stroking her hair and whispering the same words their mother used to say. "It is okay to cry, Mia. Mama is watching over us from heaven, and she would want us to be happy." Richard had sat there feeling useless and foolish, a billionaire who could buy anything in the world except the ability to comfort a grieving child. But instead of giving up, he had asked Maya to teach him what to do, swallowing his pride and admitting that he knew nothing about being a parent. That moment of vulnerability seemed to shift something in Maya's perception of him. She began to see that Richard was not pretending to care, that he genuinely wanted to help but simply did not know how. Over the following weeks, Maya started to let her guard down in small ways, answering his questions with more than one-word responses, accepting his offers of help without immediately looking for the hidden agenda. One night, about 3 months after they had moved in, Maya came downstairs to find Richard sitting alone in his study, staring at an old photograph. She approached quietly, curious despite herself, and saw that the photograph showed a young woman with kind eyes and a tired smile. "Who is that?" Maya asked softly, making Richard jump in surprise. He looked at her for a moment, then back at the photograph, and when he spoke his voice was heavy with old grief. "That is my mother," he said. "Her name was Margaret, and she died a long time ago." Maya sat down in the chair across from him, folding her legs beneath her, and waited for him to continue. Richard found himself talking about things he had never told anyone, about his father leaving and his mother struggling, and the hunger and shame of his childhood. He told Maya about his promise to make his mother proud, about his relentless climb to success, and about the guilt he carried for not being there when she died. "I thought money would make everything better," Richard admitted, his voice cracking. "I thought if I was rich enough, I would never feel that pain again, but I was wrong. All the money did was make me lonely and cold." Maya listened without interrupting, and when Richard finally stopped talking, she did something that surprised them both. She reached out and took his hand, just as he had taken hers in the restaurant that first night. "My mama used to say that God sends us angels when we need them most," Maya said quietly. "Maybe you needed us as much as we needed you." Richard felt tears rolling down his cheeks for the second time since meeting these remarkable children, and he did not try to hide them. "I think your mama was a very wise woman," he managed to say. "She was," Maya agreed, and for the first time she smiled at Richard with genuine warmth. "And I think she would have liked you, once she got past all the grumpy rich man stuff." Richard laughed, a real laugh that came from somewhere deep inside him, and he realized that he could not remember the last time he had laughed like that. From that night forward, things began to change more rapidly in the Calloway household. Maya started calling Richard by his first name instead of Mr. Calloway, and Mia started running to hug him whenever he came home from work. They ate dinner together every night, something Richard had never done with anyone, and he found himself rushing through business meetings so he could get home in time. He taught them how to play chess, and they taught him how to braid hair badly, which made everyone laugh at his clumsy attempts. He took them to museums and parks and movies, experiencing the simple joys of life that he had denied himself for so many years. And every Sunday, they would go to a small church on the south side of the city where the girls could sing in the choir, their voices rising above the congregation like prayers made of music. Richard would sit in the back pew and watch them with tears in his eyes, amazed that these two little girls had given him something all his money could never buy. They had given him a family, a purpose, a reason to be better than the man he had been. And slowly, day by day, the cold mansion that had been his prison became a warm home filled with laughter and love, and the beautiful sound of children singing. It was not always easy, and there were still hard days when Maya's walls went back up or Mia had nightmares about her mother or Richard, lost his temper over something small. But they were learning together, growing together, becoming a family in all the ways that mattered. And Richard knew, with a certainty he had never felt before, that he would never let these girls go, that he would spend the rest of his life making sure they knew they were loved and wanted and safe. Because they had saved him just as much as he had saved them, and that was a debt he could never fully repay. 1 year after the night that changed everything, Richard sat in his lawyer's office with a stack of papers in front of him, and a nervous feeling in his stomach that he had not experienced since his first big business deal. The papers were adoption documents, legal forms that would officially make Maya and Mia his daughters in the eyes of the law. It had taken months to get to this point, with social workers visiting the mansion, background checks being conducted, and countless meetings with judges and child welfare officials. Some people had questioned whether a 53-year-old bachelor with no parenting experience should be allowed to adopt 2 young girls. Others had whispered that Richard was only doing this for publicity, to improve his reputation as a ruthless businessman who cared about nothing but money. But Dr. Williams had testified that the girls were thriving under Richard's care, showing remarkable improvement in their emotional and psychological well-being. And the social workers had reported that the bond between Richard and the twins was genuine and strong, built on mutual respect and growing love. Even Philippe from La Belle Étoile had written a letter describing what he had witnessed that night, how Richard's entire demeanor had changed in the presence of the children. Now, after all the waiting and all the uncertainty, the day had finally come when Richard could make it official. His lawyer, a serious woman named Victoria who had handled his business affairs for 20 years, looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. "Richard, in all the years I have known you, I have never seen you nervous about signing anything," she said with a slight smile. "You have closed billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat." Richard laughed and wiped his palms on his expensive trousers, leaving damp marks on the fabric. "Those were just business deals," he replied. "This is something that actually matters." Victoria nodded and slid the papers across the desk toward him, along with an elegant pen. "Sign here, here, and here," she instructed, "and then those 2 little girls officially become Maya and Mia Calloway." Richard picked up the pen, but before he could sign, the door to the office burst open and the twins came running in, followed by a flustered secretary apologizing for not being able to stop them. "Richard, Richard," Mia shouted excitedly, launching herself at him and climbing into his lap. "Is it happening? Are we really going to be your daughters now?" Maya followed more slowly, but she was smiling broadly, her eyes shining with a happiness that Richard had waited a whole year to see. "I thought you 2 were supposed to wait in the lobby with Sarah," Richard said, trying to sound stern but failing completely as Mia wrapped her arms around his neck. "We could not wait anymore," Maya explained, coming to stand beside him. "We wanted to be here when you signed the papers. Is that okay?" Richard looked at his lawyer, who shrugged and smiled. "I do not see why not," Victoria said. "After all, this is about them." Richard took a deep breath and looked at the 2 girls who had transformed his life so completely. Mia was healthy now, her cheeks round and rosy, her body strong from good food and proper care, her eyes sparkling with the joy and energy of a normal 10-year-old girl. Maya was still serious and watchful, but there was a softness in her now that had not been there before. A willingness to laugh and play and trust that had taken months to develop. They were both wearing matching blue dresses that Richard had bought for this special occasion, with their hair braided in the complicated style they had tried to teach him. Looking at them now, Richard could not believe that less than a year ago they had been starving in an alley, dressed in rags and fighting to survive each day. "Before I sign these papers," Richard said slowly, "I want to make you both a promise." Maya and Mia looked at him with serious expressions, understanding that this was an important moment. Richard set down the pen and took each girl's hand in his own, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke. "I spent my whole life running from my past," he began. "I was so scared of being poor again, so scared of being hurt again, that I built walls around my heart and I pushed everyone away." He squeezed their hands gently, feeling the small fingers that had somehow gotten a grip on his soul. "I thought money would make me happy, but it only made me lonely and cold and mean. I was a terrible person for a very long time, and I hurt a lot of people with my words and my actions. Mia looked like she wanted to interrupt, to tell him he was not terrible, but Maya shook her head slightly and let Richard continue. "Then you two came into my life," Richard said, his voice breaking. "Two little girls who had lost everything but still had more love and courage than I had ever seen in anyone." He looked at Maya with gratitude and respect. "Maya, you taught me what it means to be strong, not the kind of strength that comes from money or power, but the real strength that comes from protecting the people you love no matter what." Then he turned to Mia with tenderness. "And Mia, you taught me what it means to hope, to believe in goodness even when the world has been cruel, to keep smiling even when everything seems impossible." He released their hands and picked up the pen again, holding it over the first signature line. "I promise you both, right here and right now, that I will never abandon you, not ever, not for any reason." He signed the first document with a flourish. "I promise that I will always put your happiness and your well-being before my business, before my money, before everything else in my life." He signed the second document. "I promise that I will be there for every birthday, every school play, every scraped knee, and every broken heart. I will be the father I never had, the father you both deserve." He signed the third and final document, and when he looked up, there were tears streaming down his face. But he was smiling, the biggest and most genuine smile of his entire life. "It is official," Victoria announced, her own voice slightly unsteady. "Maya and Mia, you are now legally the daughters of Richard Calloway." Mia screamed with joy and hugged Richard so tightly he could barely breathe. Maya stood still for a moment, as if she could not quite believe it was real, and then she threw herself into the hug as well, wrapping her arms around both Richard and her sister. "Thank you," Maya whispered into Richard's ear. "Thank you for giving us a home." Richard held his daughters close, breathing in the sweet smell of their shampoo, feeling their small hearts beating against his chest. "No," he whispered back, "thank you for giving me one." Later that day, Richard held a press conference to announce the adoption and to reveal something else he had been planning in secret. He was establishing a new charity called the Harmony Foundation, named after the song that had changed his life, dedicated to helping homeless children find safe homes, good education, and opportunities for a better future. The foundation would be funded by $100 million of Richard's personal fortune, with the goal of making sure that no child ever had to sing for a plate of food again. When reporters asked why he was doing this, Richard simply smiled and looked at his daughters standing beside him. "Because someone very wise once told me that we are supposed to help each other," he said, "and I have a lot of helping to catch up on." Maya and Mia beamed with pride as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, knowing that their story was now inspiring others to open their hearts and their wallets to children in need. And somewhere in heaven, a woman named Grace looked down at her daughters and smiled, knowing that her prayers had been answered in ways more wonderful than she ever could have imagined. 5 years had passed since the night that changed everything, and Maya and Mia Calloway were no longer the hungry, frightened children who had walked into La Belle Étoile begging for a chance to sing. Maya was now 14 years old, a tall and beautiful young woman with the same fierce determination in her eyes, but softened by years of love and security. She was at the top of her class in one of the best private schools in Chicago, with dreams of becoming a lawyer so she could help other children who had been abandoned by the system. Mia was also 14, having grown into a gentle and compassionate girl whose sweet nature had never been diminished by the hardships of her early life. She wanted to be a music teacher, to pass on the gift their mother had given them to other children who needed the healing power of song. Both girls had continued to sing, performing in school concerts and church choirs and charity events for the Harmony Foundation, which had grown into one of the most successful children's charities in the country. Richard had watched his daughters blossom with a pride and joy he had never thought possible, and he often found himself wondering how he had ever survived without them. He was a different man now, softer and kinder and more connected to the world around him, though he still ran his business empire with skill and determination. But the business no longer controlled him the way it once had, and he never missed a dance recital or a parent-teacher conference or a Sunday dinner with his family. Tonight was a special occasion, the 5-year anniversary of the night the twins had sung for their supper at La Belle Étoile, and Richard had planned something extraordinary. He had rented out the entire restaurant for a private celebration, inviting friends and family and supporters of the Harmony Foundation to commemorate the moment that had started it all. When the Callaways arrived at the restaurant, they were greeted by none other than Philippe, the same maitre d', who had reluctantly allowed 2 homeless children to sing for the wealthy guests 5 years ago. But Philippe was a changed man as well, having been so moved by what he witnessed that night that he had begun volunteering at homeless shelters and donating a portion of his salary to children's charities. "Welcome back, Monsieur Callaway," Philippe said warmly, bowing slightly. "And welcome back, Mademoiselles Maya and Mia. You honor us with your presence." Maya smiled at the man who had once looked at her with disgust, feeling no anger or resentment, only gratitude for the role he had unknowingly played in their story. "Thank you, Philippe," she said graciously. "It is good to be back." The restaurant was decorated beautifully, with flowers and candles and photographs from the past 5 years displayed on easels around the room. There were pictures of Maya and Mia on their first day of school, pictures of family vacations and birthday parties and holiday celebrations, pictures of charity events where the girls had performed for crowds of hundreds. And in the center of the room, enlarged and framed in gold, was a photograph that a guest had secretly taken on that fateful night 5 years ago. It showed Richard kneeling on the marble floor in his expensive suit, holding Maya's hand and looking at her with tears in his eyes while Mia watched hopefully from behind her sister. Under the photograph was a small plaque that read, "The night love found its way home." Richard stood before the gathered guests, his daughters on either side of him, and raised a glass of champagne to make a toast. "5 years ago, I was the loneliest man in Chicago," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I had more money than I could ever spend, but I had no one to share it with, no one who truly cared whether I lived or died." He looked down at Maya and Mia with such love that several guests felt tears spring to their eyes. Then 2 little girls walked into this restaurant and asked for a chance to sing, and I laughed at them. I mocked them. I said terrible things that still keep me awake at night with shame. Richard paused, gathering himself before continuing. But they sang anyway, and their song broke through every wall I had built, and for the first time in decades, I felt something other than ambition and greed. He raised his glass higher. "Tonight, I want to toast to second chances. To the power of music, to the love of a mother that never dies, and most of all, to my daughters Maya and Mia, who saved my life in every way that matters." The guests raised their glasses and drank, and then applause filled the room as Richard hugged his daughters tightly. After dinner, Philippe approached the family and asked if the girls would be willing to sing for the guests, just as they had done 5 years ago. Maya and Mia looked at each other, then at their father, who nodded with encouragement and love. They walked to the small stage that Richard had arranged, and the room fell silent just as it had on that long-ago night. But everything else was different. The girls were no longer dressed in rags, but in beautiful gowns that their father had bought for them. They were no longer hungry and scared, but healthy and confident, and surrounded by people who loved them. And when they opened their mouths to sing, it was not a desperate plea for food, but a celebration of how far they had come. They sang "You Raise Me Up," Once again, their voices more mature and powerful but still blending in that perfect harmony their mother had taught them. Maya closed her eyes and thought of Grace, imagining her mother watching from heaven with a proud smile on her face. Mia let the music flow through her like a river of light, feeling the connection to something greater than herself. And Richard sat at his table with tears streaming down his face, just as he had 5 years ago, but these were tears of joy instead of pain. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous, and the girls took a bow before running to their father and throwing their arms around him. "We love you, Dad," Maya said, using the word she had started calling him 2 years ago, the word that still made Richard's heart swell every time he heard it. "I love you too," Richard replied, his voice choked with emotion, "more than you will ever know." Later that night, as the celebration wound down and the guests began to leave, Richard stood outside the restaurant with his daughters, looking up at the same stars that had shone down on 2 hungry children 5 years ago. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Mia asked softly, leaning against her father's side. Richard nodded slowly, thinking about all the ways their story could have ended differently. "Every day," he admitted. "Every day I thank God that you two were brave enough to walk through those doors, because if you had not, I would still be the cold and lonely man I was before." Maya took her father's hand, the same hand that had reached out to her in the middle of the restaurant, and offered her hope. "Mama always said that everything happens for a reason," Maya said. "I think she sent us to you and you to us, because we all needed to be saved." Richard squeezed her hand and smiled, thinking of Margaret and Grace, 2 mothers who had loved their children with everything they had. "I think you are right," he said, "and I think both of our mothers are very happy tonight." They stood there together under the Chicago sky, a family built not from blood but from love and second chances and the beautiful power of a song. And if you had seen them in that moment, you would never have guessed that 5 years ago they were strangers, that the man in the expensive coat had laughed at the 2 little girls in rags, that their story had begun with cruelty instead of kindness. Because some stories do not end the way they begin. Some stories take the pain and the heartbreak and the long, hard journey through darkness and transform them into something beautiful. And the story of Richard Calloway and his daughters Maya and Mia was one of those rare and precious stories that remind us all of a simple but powerful truth. No matter how lost we are, no matter how broken we feel, no matter how cold the world becomes, there is always hope, there is always love, there is always a chance for a new beginning. All we have to do is open our hearts and sing.